The Hi-Fi Murders. On an ordinary evening in April 1974, in a quiet city in northern Utah, 5 people walked into the basement of a small electronics store. They were customers, employees, and parents who'd simply come looking for someone who was late coming home. None of them knew they were walking into what would become known as one of the most brutal crimes in American history. A crime so disturbing that decades later, investigators, lawyers, and the survivors themselves still struggle to talk about exactly what happened in that basement. This is the story of the Hi-Fi Murders. Ogden, Utah, in the early 1970s, was a working-class city built around the railroad, and more recently, the nearby Hill Air Force Base. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, and where a small audio equipment store on Washington Boulevard, the Hi-Fi shop, was simply a normal part of the local landscape. Teenagers came in to look at stereo systems, parents picked up records. It was unremarkable in the best possible sense of that word. On the evening of April 22, 1974, 2 employees were working what should have been a routine closing shift. Stanley Walker was 20 years old. Sherry Michelle Ansley, known to everyone as Michelle, was 18 and had only been working at the shop for about a week. She'd recently gotten engaged with a wedding planned for that August. Just before closing time, several men entered the store. 2 of them, later identified as Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews, both airmen stationed at nearby Hill Air Force Base, walked in brandishing handguns. A third man, Keith Roberts, also an airman, waited outside with the getaway vehicle. According to later accounts, as many as 3 additional men were involved in the planning or periphery of the robbery, though they were never identified or caught.
Pierre and Andrews took Walker and Ansley down into the basement of the shop, bound them, and began going through the store, loading stereo equipment into a van. It should have ended there. A robbery, frightening but survivable. It didn't. About an hour into the robbery, a 16-year-old named Courtney Naisbitt walked into the store. He wasn't a stranger. He'd come by specifically to thank Stanley Walker for letting him park his car in front of the shop earlier that day. It was an act of simple, neighborly courtesy that put him directly in the path of 2 armed men in the middle of a robbery. Courtney was taken downstairs and bound alongside Walker and Ansley. As the evening wore on, 2 more people arrived, each looking for someone who hadn't come home. Stanley's father, Orrin Walker, came by the shop when his son didn't show up for dinner. And separately, Courtney's mother, 52-year-old Carol Naisbitt, arrived looking for her son. Both were taken hostage and brought down into the basement with the others. By this point, what had started as a robbery of 2 young employees had become something else entirely. 5 people, ranging from a 16-year-old boy to 2 middle-aged parents, all bound together in a basement, at the mercy of 2 men who had already decided none of them could be allowed to leave as witnesses. What happened next is documented in extensive detail through courtroom testimony, survivor accounts, and the first-hand reporting that followed the case for years afterward. It is also, by any honest description, one of the most disturbing sequences of violence in American criminal history. Pierre and Andrews decided their hostages needed to be silenced permanently, and they settled on a method they believed would look less like outright murder. Andrews retrieved a container of liquid Drano, a corrosive drain-cleaning chemical, from their van. The hostages were told it was a mixture of vodka and sedatives, meant to keep them calm and compliant. It was not vodka. One by one, the 5 hostages were forced to drink the corrosive liquid. The effect was immediate and horrific. Chemical burns to the mouth, tongue, and throat, blistering and peeling tissue, and excruciating pain. It did not, however, kill anyone. The assailants had believed, incorrectly, that the chemical would prove fatal on its own. Orrin Walker, watching what was happening to the others, managed to avoid swallowing the liquid when it was forced on him, letting it run from his mouth and pretending to suffer the same convulsions he'd witnessed in the others. a desperate, quick-thinking act that may have ultimately saved his life. When the Drano failed to kill the hostages as intended, Pierre and Andrews escalated. According to testimony and investigative accounts, Pierre shot each hostage in the head at close range, one after another, in the basement. Stanley Walker and Michelle Ansley died at the scene. Carol Naisbitt was still alive when help arrived, but died shortly after at the hospital. Courtney Naisbitt was shot as well, and though he survived, he suffered catastrophic and permanent brain damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. Orrin Walker was shot too, and survived. But before the two men left, they subjected him to one final, almost incomprehensible act of cruelty. Pierre forced a ballpoint pen into Orrin's ear and stomped on it, driving it through his eardrum with enough force that the pen broke and exited through his throat. Before leaving the store, Pierre raped Michelle Ansley. Pierre and Andrews then finished loading stereo equipment into their van and left, having spent close to 2 hours inside the building. The 5 victims were left in the basement for nearly 3 hours before anyone discovered what had happened. It was Stanley Walker's mother and younger brother who eventually went looking for him and Orrin, both of whom hadn't returned home. When they arrived at the shop, Stanley's younger brother heard sounds coming from inside and broke down the back door. What they found inside was almost impossible to process. Bodies, blood, and Orrin Walker, gravely wounded, with a pen still lodged in his ear, somehow still alive enough to describe what had happened. Mrs. Walker called the police immediately. Despite his injuries, burns across his mouth and chin, a ruptured eardrum, multiple gunshot wounds, Orrin Walker was able to give investigators a description of the 2 main attackers. He described one as taller and more talkative, the other shorter, quieter, with a distinct Caribbean accent. It was a description that would prove critical in the hours that followed. The break in the case came quickly, and almost by accident. Hours after news of the attack spread, an anonymous tipster, an employee at Hill Air Force Base, contacted police and told them that one of the airmen, William Andrews, had previously talked about wanting to rob the hi-fi shop, reportedly even saying that if anyone got in his way, he would kill them. Then came a second break. 2 teenagers, going through a dumpster near the airmen's barracks at Hill Air Force Base, found wallets and personal belongings, including identification that had clearly belonged to the victims. They recognized the photos from news coverage and called the police immediately. Investigators descended on the base. As officers moved through the crowd of airmen gathered near the scene, 2 men stood out, pacing, gesturing, talking with unusual intensity. Those 2 men were Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews. An Air Force supervisor overseeing them independently contacted police with concerns of his own. During the search of the barracks that followed, one investigator made a discovery that would prove pivotal. Lifting a rug beneath a bunk, almost as an afterthought before leaving the room, he found a folded piece of paper, a signed lease agreement for a nearby storage unit. When investigators searched that unit, they found the stereo equipment stolen from the hi-fi shop hours earlier. Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts were all arrested. Roberts, who had remained outside in the getaway vehicle and was never identified by any witness as having entered the store, was ultimately convicted only on robbery charges, not murder. He was paroled in 1987 and took his own life in 1992. The trial of Pierre and Andrews became one of the most closely watched and controversial cases in Utah's legal history. It was moved out of Ogden due to the intensity of public emotion surrounding it, though it remained within the same judicial district. Orrin Walker served as the prosecution's key witness, recounting what he had survived in direct, harrowing testimony. Courtney Naisbitt, whose brain damage had left him with amnesia surrounding the event, was unable to testify himself. In November 1974, both Pierre and Andrews were convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Both were sentenced to death. The case quickly became entangled in something larger than the crime itself. Pierre and Andrews were black. Their victims and the jury were white, in a state and an era where that distinction carried enormous and immediate political weight. Andrews, in particular, became the center of a prolonged national debate, since it was Pierre, not Andrews, who had fired the fatal shots. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and Amnesty International, took up his case through years of appeals, arguing that race had played a role in how harshly he'd been sentenced, despite not being the one who pulled the trigger. The appeals stretched on for years. Dale Pierre, who legally changed his name to Pierre Dale Selby while on death row, was executed by lethal injection in August 1987. The first execution carried out in Utah using that method. William Andrews continued to fight his sentence for years afterward, receiving repeated stays of execution before ultimately being executed in July 1992 at the age of 37. The human cost of that night extended far beyond the basement of the hi-fi shop and far beyond the courtroom. Courtney Naisbitt, who'd simply stopped by to thank a friend, spent 266 days in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The brain damage he sustained was permanent, reshaping the entire rest of his life. He passed away in 2002, having lived for nearly 3 decades with the consequences of a single act of teenage kindness.
Gone catastrophically wrong. Orrin Walker carried his injuries for the rest of his life, as well the scarring from the chemical burns, the permanent damage to his hearing, and almost certainly the psychological weight of having survived something so many others in that basement did not. For the city of Ogden, the case left a different kind of lasting mark. It became one of the most studied and debated capital punishment cases in American legal history, cited for decades in conversations about race, sentencing, and the death penalty. And yet, despite that lasting legal significance, those who've studied the case note that it has slowly faded from public memory. A brutal piece of Utah history that, outside of the state, many people today have simply never heard of. There is no real mystery at the center of this story, in the way some other true crime cases carry an unresolved question. The men responsible were caught within hours,
Tried, convicted, and ultimately executed. What lingers instead is something harder to resolve: the sheer senseless escalation of a robbery into an act of prolonged torture against people whose only crime was being in the wrong place looking for someone they loved. 3 people went looking for a son, a brother, a friend that night, and never came home. 2 others survived, carrying what happened with them for the rest of their lives. The hi-fi shop itself is long gone now, but for the families who lived through that night in April of 1974, what happened in that basement never really ended at all.